So good night, James, Ricardo. It's a pleasure, James, to have you here with us tonight for our webinar on epistemology. We hope it to be one of many. So Ricardo will be helping me out here with the questions, and later on, the video will be available with Portuguese audio as well. So Ricardo, if you please.
All right. Hi, Matheus. Hi, James. Hi. So today's episode, we wanted to have a focus more so on epistemology and trying to understand some aspects of epistemology, clarifying those. So our questions are based on the course by Dr. Peikoff called Unity in Epistemology and Ethics. So we'll start with some very basic questions to make sure our audience, or Brazilian audience, understands what these things are. So the first question we have is, what is differentiation and integration?
Well, I'm going to start with what is epistemology. That's such a big word, epistemology, and it might intimidate people hearing it, but it is a branch of philosophy, an important branch of philosophy, the theory of knowledge. How do we know what we know? How do we acquire knowledge? What principles should we employ to acquire knowledge? What does objectivity consist of, in effect, is what the objectivist will pose it as. And the ramifications, the practical importance of this is enormous, Believing that knowledge can be acquired by horoscopes or astrological charts, say, or believing that knowledge is simply impossible, that no one will ever really know anything. We could never know anything for certain, for example. It's going to undermine your confidence tremendously, or it's going to allow you to believe in complete nonsense. So getting our answers straight on epistemology is of life and death consequence, because to act successfully, we've got to know properly. And epistemology maybe is the most important topic of all, because it answers that question. How do we know? Now, you asked differentiation and integration. Those are probably the two most basic concepts that run throughout the entire field of epistemology, the theory of knowledge. That's how human consciousness works. Consciousness, the faculty of perceiving existence, has a specific identity and works by a certain means. It would have to work by a certain means if it's going to yield knowledge. It's not the disqualifying feature, but in fact what makes it possible. But to know, we have to engage in a certain specific kind of process. Our consciousness has a very specific nature, and so does the universe have a nature. And it's in the coming together of that we acquire knowledge. And differentiation and integration are the two, and they run across the entire range of human consciousness, from sense perception all the way to the highest theory development. What the mind is doing is making distinctions, noting differences, and synthesizing, bringing back the difference into a new order. And both are essential. Both require the other. You can't have consciousness with just one or just the other. First, let's take the idea of differentiation. If there were only one thing in the universe, our method of knowledge would be impossible. Our method of knowledge is a method by which we compare, contrast differences and find certain, that's not that. This is blue is not green. If there were just one thing in the universe, we might know it with synoptic insight just by looking at it, we'd be omniscient. But if there were just one thing in this universe, our method of knowing things would simply be inoperative. We know by making distinctions. We know by saying, that's not that. Oh, that's different from that. And on one level, the sense perceptual level, it's automatic, certainly automatic for a toddler or a child. All they do is look and they see, yeah, there's red and there's green. And before they even have the words red and green, they know those two things are different because they look different. But that's not where consciousness stops, because if we were just to have differences, if we were just to distinguish and differentiate between things, we would have no basis for action. There'd be no reason to put that together and no ability to act on that integration. There'd be nothing that would connect things. There would be nothing that would integrate and actually compare and bring together things so that we could actually see a generalization or a principle in action. And that begins as early as our earliest concept formation. Actually, it begins in an automatized way even earlier. Sensations are integrated into what we perceive, the objects that we perceive automatically when we open our eyes. But at a higher level of consciousness, the conceptual level, distinguishing differences and integrating them into new units is exactly what is required. It's not just a sensation of green and that sensation of green. We now bring those experiences of green into a new unity, the concept green. And here I'm really bringing a vast number of things and in fact, an open-ended number of things into a single unity. Greenness, the concept green. And by green, I mean every shade of green and every green of the past, every green of the future, greens I haven't yet seen, greens I'll never see, every instance of green. I'm talking about millions and millions and millions of instances of green that I can use one word efficiently to cover. So green is every single word we have is an integration, but an integration that was made possible based on an earlier differentiation, an earlier distinction. And so this joint process of making distinctions, differentiating, and synthesizing them into new units is the entire function of human consciousness, whether at the perceptual or the conceptual level. That's how our mind works, by comparing and contrasting, by noting differences and then bringing those differences into a new unity. The universe is a complex place filled with many various things. And so we've got to be able to distinguish those things either on the perceptual level or on the conceptual level. And then if we're to organize our knowledge into anything useful, we've got to reintegrate those things in basically the same pattern I just used with green.
So how does, so what you were talking about is essentially the way in which we acquire knowledge. So that would be our faculty of reason. But how does our faculty of reason differentiate or is different from other faculties, like my faculty of imagination, for example? Because as I'm thinking about the kinds of things that my mind can do, I mean, I can put two things together that don't belong together. I can put, like, say, woman and fish, and I come up with mermaid. Does that mean that how does differentiation and integration apply to when I'm imagining things?
Well, we do have perception and we do have memory. Those are distinct faculties of human consciousness. And we have the capacity to creatively rearrange in our imaginations, perceptual things. Those are not what I mean by conceptual reasoning at all. Conceptual reasoning is a specific process. By the way, a specific process humans had to learn. Humans are born not knowing anything. We have to look in order to know. And the same holds true with consciousness. We have to figure out how we figure things out. We have to learn how to learn. So all of those things that our consciousness does, we have emotions, we have physical automatized reactions to our values, we have memories, we have imagination where we can reconfigure things we've already seen or experienced, but reconfigure them, rearrange them in our own minds. No, the process of thought, the process of cognition, that is to say, discovering truth about the world, is what I mean by reason. And that requires observation of the world, contact with the world, and the logical integration of that material of sense perception. The conceptual and consistently logical integration of all of that material has to occur for it to be what I call valid knowledge. That's the process of reason. Discovering the process of reason was a human discovery, But even before we discovered it, we were in fits and starts using reason. As to quote Molière, we were speaking prose without even knowing it. right? We were doing it in fits and starts, unself-consciously, of course, and to the extent that we were doing it almost by accident correctly, we were getting the truth. But it was only when we discovered the rules of logic, the ancient Greeks, for example, especially Aristotle, who gave us the real first idea of what objectivity was. What I mean by thought is I mean a process of finding out reality by adhering to reality. And that means that our ideas, no matter how abstract, have to be reducible to sense perception, to observation itself. So that no matter how abstract my theory or my concept, it has to be reducible to the facts of reality as I perceive them. And the other requirement is that it has to follow logic. It has to be logically consistent. And by logical consistency, I mean a logically consistent whole. Just as each concept is a universal that talks about all instances of green, so my whole conceptual framework gives me an ability to integrate the sum of my knowledge into an integrated, consistent whole. We go from green, oh, those are greens, those are reds. Oh, well, what's that? Oh, those are colors. And colors, well, that's different than sound. Sounds are something like over here. So I have two different concepts, and that's a loud sound or a soft sound. Or let's take chair. I say that's a chair. I discovered that concept. It doesn't stand just for that chair, but all chairs. So I go up to the level of abstraction, furniture, man-made object. And as I go up wider and wider to the highest philosophical abstract, existence, entity, existence, the highest chain, I'm covering everything. And so in creating these universals, these generalized principles, going back to generalized concepts, what I'm doing is I'm able to integrate more and more and more of the data that my sense perception gives me. And I'm able to organize those concepts in such a way that they can become an integrated whole of knowledge. And this is absolutely essential to being clear and certain about my knowledge. Were I to leave out any portion of knowledge, then to that extent, I have some doubt. It hasn't been successfully integrated into the whole of my knowledge. Ayn Rand says something very remarkable in Atlas Shrugged. No concept is valid unless it can be integrated without contradiction into the whole of your knowledge. But it is only the validity of concepts and the ability to develop a conceptual framework where all of my concepts are interrelated to one another that makes this possible. And in turn, that's related to the fact, and these relationships that I have with words, with all due respect to Hume and Wittgenstein and the nominalists, are not mere conveniences. They're based on factual relationships. All tables really do have something important in common. And if I try to sit my cup on something that isn't a table, on a lamp, it'll fall over. So the tables are real. That relationship between all tables was a real relationship that I discovered. In reality, more than that, I discovered that things are causally related. There's chains of causal interaction that I discover. From the simplest moment as a child when I push a ball and I realize that pushing a ball on a flat surface causes it to roll, I'm beginning to understand the idea. So it starts very, very early. It's a very early and universal thing about action and the nature of things that I learn implicitly very, very early in my development. But that idea of causality implicitly learned, it starts to appear everywhere. Starts to appear, gee, when it gets cold, water freezes. Every time it gets this cold, water freezes. Every time it gets this hot, water becomes steam and evaporates. Every time water gets that hot, there's steam and evaporates. And I begin to learn that there are causal chains and that these causal chains are all interactive. And so this causal chain is interactive with this causal chain. And so in fact, in reality, the conceptual generalizations that I'm reaching are, it is true, based on our mind's method of dealing and knowing the world, reducing things in effect to a manageable number of units conceptually, but it can only be manageable number of units if they're based on a real fact of reality, a relationship that it does exist in reality. Primarily, these are causal relationships, and thus we're looking at a single universe. And in this sense, all of the interactions, causal interactions and relationships between things in this single universe my mind has to match. My mind has to be as ruthlessly integrated as the world is interactive and integrated. It's one universe. I mean, imagine two universes, like a matrix world, right? Where you plug into one universe and you plug into another, except it's not even like a matrix where there's some bridge. Imagine two totally separate universes. That's not what we're talking about. And knowledge as we know it would not be possible. No, it's one universe, and therefore our knowledge must be rendered into a unified, consistent whole if it is to deal with that. I mean, if you look at the history of knowledge, that's the way it works. We get to the point, you know, people can discover simple things about, say, falling objects on Earth, and then observe things about stars in the solar system, you know, the weird motions of planets around the sun. What could the two possibly have in common? Kepler develops his rules about planetary motion. Galileo starts doing experiments, you know, little afterwards, but roughly the same time in history, about pendulums and falling objects. Newton comes along and says, guess what, guys? It's all the same thing. It's all the same thing, whether it's an object falling on Earth or whether it's a planet orbiting around the sun, the same principle. In fact, I can reduce to a handful of principles, said Newton, all the rules about that will tell you, explain to you the motion of every physical object that we can visibly see in the solar system, all of them. So the process of human knowledge is a process of integration, of unifying our knowledge into more and more completely and totally integrated wholes. But that's to reflect the actual relationships that do exist in reality. Did that answer your question? I know it's a long answer, but did that answer your question?
So it seems to me that, you know, in this process of acquiring knowledge, right, and in part, it starts with differentiation and integration. It seems to me that there's a sense in which it's a difficult process. It's not an obvious process, and it's not an automatic process. And certainly mistakes can be made, right?
Oh, yes.
And if I can have ideas in my mind which come from imagination, for example, so just because I have content in my mind, it doesn't mean it's correct. So I can make it up, or worse, let's say I can make a mistake. So I'm trying to make a proper integration, but for some reason I made an error. So how can I analyze, let's say, or how can I know that the content I have in my mind actually corresponds to reality, as opposed to just being some mistakes or lots of mistakes?
Well, there are all kinds of mistakes that can be made. And obviously, prior to the discovery of an objective method, and this is the key here, the discovery of an objective method of knowing. Going back to something I said earlier, just as we discover the facts about reality, so we have to discover how to properly use our consciousness. If I were to go by my feelings and what I want to believe to be the case, and if I put my feelings over the facts, I'd be making a huge and potentially deadly mistake. And as I say, even before the discovery of logic by the ancient Greeks, people were using reason, but in an unsystematic, unself-conscious way. It was kind of hit and miss, right? When it worked, it worked. Boy, we got it, and that's the truth. Yeah. If we didn't get it, boy, we may be living for millennia under a delusion. That's why the discovery of methods of knowing, why epistemology is such a vital topic. Aristotle actually discovered basic rules of deductive logic. He said, look, in order to know, you've got to observe. You've got to go look. We're born tabula rasa. Knowing anything must be grounded in observation. Secondly, you can't contradict yourself. There are no contradictions in reality. There simply are no contradictions. Please observe to me. No, things always are what they are and nothing else at the same time and in the same respect. Therefore, and he made it seem simple, made it seem like all of these things in effect emanate from the law of non-contradiction, but he actually was building it on ancient pre-Euclidean geometry, where he was, and more than that too, rhetorical forms of argument that the sophists would use. But actually, the objective basis for this was geometry. What are these Pythagoreans, what are these early geometry guys doing? How did they figure this out about triangles and angles? What's going on there? And by figuring out how they figured it out, and looking at the way his master Socrates would dust people in rhetorical arguments, he started figuring things out. You have to be logical, to be consistent with the conclusion, with what you started at, the facts you knew at the beginning. You have to obey certain rules of logic, deductive rules of logic. He identified the primary forms, how they work, and a bunch of the primary fallacies, how they don't. The epistemology of Aristotle was the birth of self-conscious science in one way, because it gave us a method, an objective method, by which I could say, this isn't just my imagination. I'm not just going by my feelings. I'm accounting for the possibility of error when I rigorously and carefully and self-consciously apply an objective method. Now, Aristotle didn't fully understand objectivity, nor did he understand all the means of human knowledge. In the early scientific revolution, men like Galileo, men like Francis Bacon, 400 years ago, scientists who were developing the experimental method, which I would have to point out was based basically on Aristotelian philosophy. The late Professor John Herman Randall demonstrated to my satisfaction that Galileo himself got the experimental method from the Aristotelians at the School of Padua in Italy. But be that as it may, the experimental method, controlling the factors so that we can force an answer from reality that would otherwise be invisible. Control the factors, zero in on the difference that made a difference, or the similarity that made the similarity, and we can discover things penetrating the perceptual world and discover the invisible relationships between things on a conceptual level, penetrating the perceptual world, understanding the conceptual world, but that requires an intense kind of integration and the discovery of a certain methodology of knowing. What I have to do is lay out all the potential factors. I've got to control for those factors, zero in on the one factor that seems to be then confirm that through observation, the experimental method. Beyond that, Ayn Rand's discovery of the theory of measurement omission in concept formation, the function of concepts in unit economy, how that is the model indeed for all conceptual thought, to the most abstract scientific theories, all the way down to our earliest concepts like table and green that I started with. All of those, the discovery of how we develop concepts, what exactly concepts refer to in reality, how to form our concepts, therefore objectively, how to use logic objectively, and indeed how to inductively infer from observation correctly, were all themselves inductive discoveries, were all themselves scientific discoveries. But by having those tools and consciously and self-consciously applying them, we can account for the possibility of error and get to the truth. Look at the practical results today. We land craft on the moon on a dime. We split invisible atoms to release the power of stars. We can alter molecules to change the very nature of a living species, a living organism. We are awesomely powerful in our knowledge. Knowledge is power. And if anything if we've learned anything since the Industrial Revolution and the age of science, it's that, as Bacon said, knowledge is power. And so, yeah, we can know. We can know with certainty. And that knowledge can give us extraordinary power. Look at the power we have over the physical world thanks to the developments of science. But how do we do that? How do we know we're doing it? If your question is, how do we know we're right? We have to apply an objective method. And that's why Ayn Rand called her philosophy objectivism. One of the main reasons. It refers to this methodology, a methodology that accounts both for the facts of reality, which even Aristotle understood and being consistent with them, but also the human method of knowing, the conceptual method of knowing. So this full understanding of the need for method is precisely what gives your knowledge confidence and objectivity.
So when I'm learning something that is something easy like a table, that's kind of easy to grasp, let's say. Certainly we grasp that at the age of 2 or so, and maybe for a 2-year-old that's difficult. But as we are, let's say, adults, some ideas are certainly more difficult to grasp than others, especially these perceptually obvious things like tables. One example would be capitalism, so a political system. Right. So if I'm trying to learn something, does that mean that, let's say, I read a book on the subject and then I know it, I can file it as like I know it, or is it something that I have to return to it? And this is, to make the connection, this is in objectivism, what is referred to as the spiral theory of knowledge. So could you explain this process of having to go back to it, and how exactly does that work?
Well, that is the way our mind works. It's not as though we start out one day and we say, okay, I'm going to learn biology, and then I'm going to learn history, and then I'm going to learn mathematics. And I'm not going to go on to mathematics or biology until you know what I'm saying? I'm going to learn biology first or second, and I'm going to finish, and I'll get complete knowledge of biology, and my knowledge of biology will be all complete. And then I'll move on to physics, and then I'll move on to philosophy, and then I'll move on to, no. That's not the way human knowledge works at all, Human knowledge is constantly a revisiting of everything else that we know. And again, it is only having a conceptual framework that actually makes this possible. But as we add knowledge, go beyond this simple table level of a concept like table, as we go from abstraction to abstraction, further away, further up the chain, away from the perceptual, so that it's more and more and more abstract, methodology becomes all the more crucial that we follow it very, very rigorously. But let's use an example so we can concretize this. Let's take a philosophical concept like causality, I mentioned before. When we're toddlers, we learn causality in various ways, right? I close my eyes, I don't see. I open my eyes, I do see. So causality related to my own actions and consciousness. Or I push a ball on a flat surface and it rolls. A ball pushed on a flat surface will roll, and every time I roll the ball, it rolls. And there I'm getting a very basic idea of cause and effect. I don't have a word for it yet, because I don't need a word for it. It's such a universal phenomenon. Some things cause other things. This led to that. This is what was necessary for that to happen. I don't know how you want to phrase it, but we don't have words at that level, but we don't need them. Causality is not an axiom. That is to say, it's not directly in itself perceived like existence or consciousness is. It's a corollary of the axiom of identity, action applied to change, and it requires multiple observations to get to the concept of causality, even implicitly. But my first implicit grasp of causality is a very generalized one, a very, very generalized one. Our first idea of causality comes from the inside. When I do things, I have a conscious goal or purpose. And so I went to the store because I was hungry and I needed food. And so I went to the store, and you say, well, why did you go to the store? I was hungry. Primitive human beings had only a notion of teleological, or what Aristotle said, final causation. That's why everything was spirits and gods, or ultimately the one God. There's some consciousness out there, like me. The sun is leaping up in the sky just as I leap up in the morning out of bed. We were imputing, in effect, our consciousness onto the world. So we had to we had to learn something about cause and effect. That cause and effect can happen without any conscious purpose involved. And that's, of course, when science begins. Thales, the ancient scientist, said, the silting of the Nile is a perfectly natural thing. Gods don't cause it. It comes from water coming down, and water will just silt, rivers will just silt as they get to the sea. Leads him to think erroneously everything's water. But here he's using observation to come to a causal explanation for the silting of rivers. Now that may lead him to an erroneous abstract conclusion of everything is water, but that's science because he leaves out the gods. He leaves out teleological explanation. More than that, as we develop further knowledge, we begin to understand even better about causality. For example, modern science has taught us that there's an intimate relationship between mathematics and physics. To do theoretical physics today, you have to know advanced mathematics. The only way to really do it is to use mathematics. What we're discovering is quantifiable relationships. And at that level of abstraction, the only way we can think about them really effectively is in mathematical formula. Further and further going up the level of integrating more and more and more, you see. But causality itself, although we had a primitive grip on it as children, pushing a ball or closing our eyes, we had to, with every new instance of discovery, both in human history and myself as I was growing up, I had to refine my concept of cause and effect, sophisticate it, develop it, understand it. Oh, I see. I see how it operates with physical objects. I see how it operates with human beings. I see what we mean when we say cause and effect here. I see what we mean when we say the difference, say, between teleological causation, I went to the store because I was hungry, or mechanical causation, I went to the store because I had a motor vehicle that could take me there. But that's the great example of the spiral theory of knowledge. Our knowledge of causality is very primitive indeed. It's a corollary to an axiom. It's something we learn when we're toddlers, implicitly, before we even have a term causation. And yet, by the time we get a term causation and we need a concept, cause and effect, right? Our concept of causality has already sophisticated and further, and will continue to sophisticate. And that's what I mean, in effect, by what we mean by the spiral theory of knowledge. Our understanding of causality enriches every time we come back around to a concept, even though it was a very primitive concept, maybe one of the earliest concepts we learned, and maybe it was even operative before we even had a term for it.
So on this idea that our knowledge is constantly evolving, right? And that sometimes we'll learn something new that becomes like an interesting insight. That's one of the quotes from this course from Leonard Peikoff, where he says, there are no branches of knowledge. And I remember listening to that the first time, and I was like, huh? You don't know biology and history? Like, what are you talking? You're a professor of philosophy. You don't know that's a branch.
Oh, and he's very proud to say that he's a specialist.
Yeah.
He knows a lot about philosophy, but he's proud to say he's not an expert on anything else.
Yeah. So,
but he also says here, there are no, it's a paradoxical statement. Obviously, there are branches of knowledge, and there's a reason for branches of knowledge, but it's totally man-made, totally human artifact. It totally has to do with our means of knowing. Well, there are facts and reality that make it convenient for us, but it's a man-made distinction primarily. All the facts, metaphysically speaking, all the facts of reality are simultaneous. It's not as though reality comes in discrete bits. This is pure biology, this is pure physics, this is pure mathematics, this is pure human history. No. It all happens simultaneously, and it's all coming at me at once in one big simultaneous blast of multiplicity and when I'm a child, confusion. And so what we do is we break down this big complex world of many, many things, big to the title, the one and the many, or unity in epistemology here. We're finding unity because, as I say, there are facts and reality which indicate this would be a good breakdown. But it's for our purposes that we're breaking things down into different fields of study. We're carving things up into cross sections for specialized study. Let's just take the human body. Let's study the human body physiology. Let's study the human mind from the standpoint of consciousness and its automatized and volitional operations, psychology. Let's study living organisms, and just living organisms, because they're unique. They're different than rocks. Trees and microbes and animals are just totally different in many important ways than, say, planets, stars, and rocks and dust. And so we say biology as a means of carving that section out for specialized study. See, what we've done there is getting back to differentiation and integration. We've differentiated a whole class of things, living organisms, and we've integrated them so that we can do effective integration on the things they distinctly have in common. But now even imagine this. Can you imagine one scientist saying, I'm going to ignore what the other scientists are doing? Or even in the humanities, can you imagine, for example, a historian saying, I don't care what medical science has to say about the bubonic plague. I want to study the 13th century, in which a third to a half of the population of Europe was wiped out by the bubonic plague, but I don't care about the facts of medicine, and nothing you tell me in medicine could have anything to do with what I, as a historian of the 1300s, excuse me, the 14th century, that's the 14th century, whew, that was a mistake, 14th century in Europe, which wiped out a third to a half of the population. Pretty horrific. Ignore medicine. It was, spirits, that caused this to happen. What would that be a good historian? Or if I were a historian and I were to ignore Marcus's field, economics, and I would say, well, economics has nothing. I don't want to know anything about economics. Cut me off. I'm a historian. I don't do economics. I don't do medicine. Of course, that would be insane. You could never really know history. But this is also true of every other field. No field of study is hermetically sealed from every other field of study, precisely because we're breaking it up as a mental convenience for specialized study. In reality, everything is simultaneous. And as we said before, that's only one universe, and all of the causes are interactive. There's no way, and in fact, let me give you a great example. My book on Christianity, Creating Christ. I'm studying the origins of Christianity. Well, to understand the origins of Christianity, I have to go through all of the relevant ancient texts. Well, that's true. But what else do I have to do? I have to go through the archaeology, the coinage, the numismology, the physical evidence, the Christian catacombs. I have to compare it to other religions. I have to look at the philosophical culture at the time. I have to look at the economics and the politics of the period, the Roman Empire and the Jewish War. And if I leave any of those facts out, my history is going to be inferior. No, I don't have to be a medical doctor. No, I don't have to be an economist. But if my historical theory is going to be valid, it has to be consistent with that, with everything I know. There can be no inconsistencies with anything else in human knowledge. As I say, the only thing that makes that possible is a conceptual framework, wherein we can actually integrate our knowledge into a unified, consistent whole. To arrive at a contradiction anywhere is to have a problem, is to admit an error, to have a gap, to say, I don't know, or I made a mistake. Gee, there's something I need to figure out if it looks like there's a contradiction somewhere, because there cannot be a contradiction. So when we say there's no particular specialized fields of study, all we're recognizing is the metaphysical fact that reality isn't divided up into biology and history and psychology and physiology. It's how we divide up the universe for specialized study. But even when we do that, we have to recognize the profound interactions between the two. To be a proper medical doctor relies on good chemistry. Good chemistry relies on good physics. Good physics relies on good mathematics. And I could go up the chain the other way around. If the doctor didn't keep the mathematician alive, he would, it's all an interactive process. It's all an interactive process. Or if, say, the medical doctor found that there was some theory of cancer that suddenly made your formula no longer applicable, that might have in other words, for the mathematical formula to be valid, it has to be applicable in every context that the person said it was, all the way down to medicine, history, and you see? To obtain knowledge, it has to be an integrated whole. And even though there are factual reasons why we break things down the way we do, different sciences are merely a human way of breaking things down for analysis.
from my experience in academia, I have a degree in philosophy. We have to send this clip, like this last 8 to 10 minutes, we have to send to some university professors, because I get the sense that far more professors apply the incorrect way that you're describing. So the lack of connectivity, the lack of relations, as opposed to actually realizing.
They're proud. They're proud and being able to break things down into irreconcilable uniquenesses. No. Well, based on Hume and modern, I mean, it's gotten to a ridiculous state in philosophy. Philosophy isn't about helping us think efficiently or get to know reality. No. They're lost in their own world, and given the premises they have, the subjectivist, skeptical, they call it empiricist premises that they have, all that they can have are these unique sensory differences. That's what Hume basically taught. All there are is these discrete sensory experiences. We can never really organize it into an understanding of entities and cause and effect. That's not, certainly we can't get facts from or values from facts. There's no odd thing. That's just a question of feelings. So if it is just a question of discrete sensations and emotions, you get modern philosophy and the basic tenor of the contemporary intellectual world. If I were to talk like this with most people, they go, "Oh, you're painting in broad strokes. Whoa, slow down. Those are those are huge abstractions. How could people see? I'm doing what the mind should be doing, integrating, organizing it into a unified whole. That every instinct in their diseased, minds, based on modern philosophy, gets them to disintegrate, to put the proper healthy functioning of human consciousness in reverse."
I mean, just an anecdote. I remember once doing a presentation where I was connecting Heraclitus with Hegel. And this was a big no-no to the professor, because I was making a connection. And I was saying, these ancient ideas, one of these main philosophers was Heraclitus, this can be identified in Hegel and then later on to other authors. And this was exactly like you said, like slow down. This is not.
Oh, you can't go there. You're comparing Heraclitus to Hegel? Well, the ironic thing is, of course, is that there'd be no Hegel without Kant, Aristotle, Plato, and the pre-Socratics, right? I mean, Hegel himself was a student of Plato and Aristotle, and he was going to correct Kant. And so without understanding the great philosophers of the past, you cannot understand Hegel. It is simply, I mean, Hegel, it's hard to read Hegel. I mean, if you're trying to read a page of Hegel, it's difficult enough. I mean, he's one of the most obtuse philosophers ever. But nonetheless, you can't understand Hegel if you can't understand the influence, especially of Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, each of whom had a profound influence on Hegel, right?
So my next question is one alongside history and the importance of the relationship between history and the philosophy. One of the quotes from Dr. Peikoff is that history precedes philosophy. So my question is, what is the why is knowledge of history relevant to the study of philosophy?
Well, objectivists are used to our form of metaphysical argumentation. An implicit knowledge of certain metaphysical ideas, and even a certain implicit knowledge of certain epistemological ideas, is sort of built in, and it comes early on. And as I was explaining about, say, causality, right? We get that in a very primitive way, even before we have the word causality or a concept cause and effect at all. But we have that general idea, and that is what allows us to discover causal connections. I push the ball, it rolls. And now I understand, there's this thing, causality. I affect the cause, I get the effect. And, but as I say, we spiral around. The more we learn about causality, the more I learn about science, the more I learn about causality in human character, the more I learn about causality in history and politics. This is true for philosophy and history as well. Philosophy, in one sense, is more primary, and most objectivists understand that, because in truth, there are certain implicit metaphysical concepts that we have that underlie and are the foundation for everything else that we know. On the other hand, philosophy is the study of humanity, mankind. It's basically it's the most human, in effect, of all of the sciences, because it studies the relationship between human consciousness and the world. It's that broad a topic. And so it gives us normative advice on how to think, be logical, be objective, if I can summarize it. It gives us normative advice on how to behave, be rational, be moral, have integrity, don't violate other people's rights. So it's normative as well as factual, but it's a human subject. And it is based on a bunch of abstractions. And Ayn Rand always insisted that the abstractions of her philosophy were all inductively generated. I mean, really, apart from the most basic axioms, existence, consciousness, and identity, which are obvious in every instance of sense perception, so we really don't need a word for them as children, right? It's just so obvious and so pervasive. But literally, apart from the true axioms, everything else is inductively learned. So if I were to make a politics argument, and I were to say, well, freedom works, freedom is what generates human well-being and material prosperity and allows us to be most human and most happy. How do I get that off the ground without some knowledge of human nature? How do I get that off the ground without some knowledge of comparative human experience with and without freedom? For example, the different configurations of freedom and how they had an effect on people? No, history is in effect before any company, because it's the factual basis for what humans have done and have been. That is what informs us of what human nature is. Ayn Rand would often say, before the Industrial Revolution, I could never have come up with this idea that reason is man's basic tool of survival. She organized her whole ethics. Around the whole idea that since reason is our basic means of knowing, it's our basic means of surviving, and therefore it is the primary virtue, and all of her virtues, in effect, are expressions of be rational, act rationally, think rationally. So when you think about it at that level, the organization of our knowledge is, again, kind of what we're talking about here and bringing it in to unity. We can't engage in the abstractions that philosophers engage in until we've reached a certain age, until we've built up enough knowledge that we can inductively infer things. And I can infer things from my own personal experience. Absolutely, those are vital. From my own introspection. And that's where I get a lot of my ideas, basic implicit philosophical ideas when I'm a child. Those first level philosophy ideas that are sort of built into everyone, and from the beginning, if they're conscious at all, and form the basis for the rest of their knowledge. But again, you see, there's this spiral. And one of the important parts of that spiral is I'm learning about myself, and maybe even more important than personal experience is historical knowledge. Historical knowledge is the factual basis for inductive generalizations about humanity. Ayn Rand studied as an undergraduate at university history. It kind of mystified Dr. Peikoff. Why would you do that? You're into literature and philosophy. Why would you do? No, well, how would I know about human nature if I didn't learn the way humans really did act, behave, and how things have happened in human history? You can't defend any proposition in philosophy, really, without some kind of factual basis that is broad enough to tell you this is true about human nature. History provides the necessary factual basis for the inductive inference that nearly all of philosophy consists of. But again, it's going to be a back and forth procedure. I'm going to learn some things about humans from my experience and from history. I'll then check my philosophical concepts. I'll sophisticate those. Those in turn will lead to new questions in specialized areas, and so forth and so on, as I spiral up, constantly revisiting all of my old knowledge when I discover something new. And you'll find that it has an effect all the way down through the whole of one's knowledge.
And just to add my parenting concern question. So that's what explains the reason that there are no objectivist children. You know, you can say often in the US, you say, oh, my child, like we are Christians. And so the kid is a Christian. And it's like, he barely, all right, I guess I pray, so I'm a Christian. You can say that, he is he goes for like the Yankees or the Redskins or a particular football team. But being any of those things, whether it's a religion or in support of a particular team, those don't require any work from the child. And that's why you can just say that they are that thing. But there are no children, there's no objectivist child, and probably not even objectivist teenager either.
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. Every 4-year-old is an objectivist in a way, as best as they can be. Or my pet dog will never be a philosopher because my poor pet dog is not conceptual. But in a sense, he can't help but be an objectivist. He's perfectly egoistic. He's perfectly consistent with reality. He's adhering to the facts as he perceives them. He's utilizing his own method as best as he can. Now, he lacks everything that makes objectivism, the entire conceptual field. So he can never really be an objectivist. It's totally inapplicable. Ignore what I just said. But in another sense, what objectivism is striving to do, we are beings of volitional consciousness. We can screw up. We don't have to follow the correct method. We have to discover the correct method. It's all up to us, in effect. But when we do discover the right methods, when we do the right things, all we're doing is getting that same correct relationship between reality and our values, reality in our life, that animals take for granted.
Yeah. So one of the key concepts in epistemology, and one of the most, perhaps the most fundamental concept in epistemology is focus. Right? So it's the precondition to be able to think, even before we can actually differentiate or integrate anything, we have to be in focus. So can you explain what does it mean to be in focus? And this is probably a big concern for all young students of objectivism. Does being in focus imply being logical or being correct?
Oh, no, neither. Focus is the effort it takes to increase the level of effort that you're applying to thought. It's that simple. It's been compared to an on-off switch, but it's really more like a dimmer switch, right? There are different levels of focus, right? Very intense, full on, all I'm thinking about is this one thing and using all of my powers on it. Or it can be just turned on and somewhat just aware and alert that I need to be attentive if something should come up. Focus basically is the internal choice that all of us have to make the effort to think or not, to use our mind or not, to blur out and to evade, or, and there is an active process of evasion as well, but to just simply not take the effort to integrate, to not take the effort to differentiate on a conceptual level where it's volitional. And that's all we mean. Volition, free will for Ayn Rand is nothing more than this, the act of mental focus. We all know that to increase the level of our mental activity and acuity, it takes an effort. To think more clearly, I have to engage in that effort. Now, we don't have to be constantly on, full blower all the time. We have to know what we're doing when we're doing it at all times. We have to be, in effect, our hand has to be on the dimmer switch. We have to know, oh, this is a moment where I have to really increase my focus. That's appropriate. I'm doing my job. I'm writing. I'm talking to you right now, so that my mental focus knob has to be up at the high end. Then there are other times when I need to be alert that something might happen, but I'm not deep in the throes of some communication project or some creative thought project. So there's different levels of focus, but focus is simply the ability, and it does take effort. It's the ability to engage in the effort of increasing my mental acuity. It's that simple. Am I thinking? Am I actively processing it? And as we were talking before, differentiation, integration. On the conceptual level, that takes volitional effort. That is not automatic. Synthesizing things into new concepts, differentiating things, well, that's not the same as that. That often takes careful analysis, careful synthesis. That's the effort I'm talking about here. The conceptual level, volitional effort to do that integrating and differentiating that we were talking about at the beginning. That's all we mean. And it's different than logic. A person can be in full focus and not really think of all the people before Aristotle in the discovery of logic self-consciously. As I say, sometimes they were sort of accidentally, but sometimes they were being logical and sometimes they weren't. But that they could be in full focus in both cases. They just don't have the correct method yet. They're alert, they're trying to figure things out as best as they can. They just don't have the correct methodology yet. So being logical, even being objective, is not to be equated with being in focus. Being in focus means, are you engaged in the effort of clear thought, accurate thought? Are you stepping up the level of your awareness? And that does take effort. That's what we mean by focus.
So that's one of the main ideas in objectivism, is that reason is man's means of survival. And so the question is, if one wants to be moral, which means, I am being productive, I am taking my life, I'm guiding my own life, not depending on other people. Does that mean that for me to do these things, I always have to be, let's say, in full focus? Or do I always have to be like thinking like at my max, this really hard thinking? So when I wake up, should I really be, really thinking about all the problems in the world throughout the day?
Well, you can't. First of all, you can't. And second of all, thinking is for living. I don't live in order to think. I think in order to live. So thinking is beyond the perceptual, my only way of knowing anything. And therefore, it is my basic means of successfully acting. It is my basic means of survival. Forget my hands, forget my hammer, forget my car. Those are derivative tools. My reason is my basic tool of survival. Absolutely. Absolutely. It is still a tool. It is still for the purpose of living. If I turn my life over to simply being a thinking machine, I'm not being rational. I'm not using reason appropriately as a means of survival. No, because that's what it is. It's a means of knowing, and it's a means of survival. It's not the categorical imperative or the Christian duty to go torture yourself forever, to bear the cross of total rationality, to solve every question and to answer every problem that's ever been formulated. No. Look, I know that to do something productive, I have to be creative and rational. And I want to be able to support my own life. I know to know anything, I have to be perfectly rational. So if the purpose of my activity is to know, if the purpose of my activity is to be productive, then rationality is unavoidable. And I'm going to be rational at the highest degree I can. But that's an enjoyable process. It's a rewarding process. I'm getting positive feedback from the process, and it's in my nature. I've got to figure it out. I know I can't just magically have the effect without the cause. I can't get $1 million just by, wishing for $1 million. I've got to come up with something creative and persuade people to buy it from me, and so forth. And so understand that reason is a means. Yes, it's our only means of knowledge. And yes, it's our basic means of survival, but that's what it's for. So when you're engaged in productive work, when you are trying to figure something out, be rational, be perfectly rational as you can, and as rational as the situation calls for. Sometimes that's hard work. It is hard work sometimes, no question about it. But the other thing is that humans can't sustain that. And what we're doing it for is so that we can have a happy, thriving life. And not only that, I'll even go further. In order for me to think efficiently, I need to take breaks. In order for my brain to work properly, I need to rest. I need a distraction. I need to think about something else. I need to get lost in emotion. I need to go make out with my wife or listen to music to break up the constant effort of thought so that my thinking itself will be more efficient. But my thinking was only so that I could have an overall good life. It's part of my good life. Now, it's maybe the single most important part of having a good life, but rationality is still just part of living, part of having a good life.
Matheus, you want to do the outro?
Well, it was amazing to have the chance to have you with us tonight. I'm sorry because my voice is not helping me today.
Oh, I can't detect any problem at all, Marcus. You sound fine, but I'm sorry you're having a throat problem.
So I hope you enjoyed the opportunity to be with us. We learned a lot, and I expect to make this presentation available as soon as possible to all our viewers. And
can I just say something?
Yeah, for sure.
I know this is kind of still in the pilot project phase for you guys, but you guys are doing something very important and very ambitious. And I really wish you all the best. And if there are people who are now listening to us, please, I mean, consider the sort of thing that these guys have got in mind. If you like what we're doing, this kind of program, I know it's very philosophical and abstract, do consider becoming a fan of these guys. If you guys are going to be on YouTube, right? So hit subscribe, hit like, hit share, hit comment. Absolutely. You guys are great. I had a great time here.
Many thanks, James. And don't worry, I'm going to send you those questions about Austrian economics and Austrian scholars for us to have a new webinar.
Oh, yeah, so, I'll see what I can do.
So thanks, Ricardo. So a good night, my.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. Great questions. And thank you, Marcus. This is a great show.
Thank you.